My name's Richard Stevenson and I'm the Heritage Education Officer for Gateshead Council, and I'm based here at the Heritage Centre, which is called Gateshead Heritage St Mary's because it's in the former St Mary's Church, which used to be the mother church of Gateshead. I've been working with the council for 2.5 years now on a 3-year project, and in that time a lot of children have been working with me from the local schools about something that's not well known, which is actually the Great Fire of Gateshead and Newcastle, which happened way back in 1854. And it's with great pleasure I can tell you a bit about it now, because really this is one of the most important things in the history of the North East, and virtually nobody knows about it. So hopefully it'll be an education for you, just as it has been for those 6,000 children. Looking at the quayside as it is today in 2011, it's very difficult to imagine what it must have been like back in the year 1854. In 1854, it was an incredibly industrial area. There were ships coming up and down the Tyne every single day. They were importing all sorts of things to the country, but most importantly, they were exporting from Gateshead and Newcastle coal, glass, chemicals, things that were made in the northeast. We are now standing below the current Tyne Bridge. The proper name for it is, of course, the New Tyne Bridge. Back in 1854, of course, there was no sign of this bridge. The old Tyne Bridge was there instead. It was a massive stone bridge that is currently where the swing bridge is today, and that bridge saw people crossing, it saw wagons and carts crossing as well. Unfortunately, it did stop any boats getting further on up the Tyne, so what happened because of that bridge was Newcastle and Gateshead quayside became an incredibly busy place. Along here there were factories, there were warehouses, there were many pubs and inns. Now where the current Tyne Bridge is, where the South Tower is, of course, on the Gateshead side, back in 1854 was one very tall structure. It was mainly made of wood, and it was a worsted factory owned by a man called Mr. Wilson. And Mr. Wilson's worsted factory made cloth, which is what worsted is. We believe that the fire started here. Certainly the local police officer who spotted the fire first, he reported it being at Wilson's worsted factory. Next door to the factory was an absolutely massive warehouse owned by a man called Charles Bertram. Charles Bertram was a Scotsman, and he was a local magistrate and merchant. Now this is a reading from the Gateshead Observer newspaper of the 7th of October 1854. Great calamity. About 20 minutes before 1 o'clock this morning, a fire broke out in the worsted cloth factory owned by Mr. Wilson in Hillgate, Gateshead. This factory contained wool, cloth and oil. These materials were like food to the fire. It spread very quickly, and in less than half an hour the whole factory was, from top to bottom, like a sheet of flames. Next door, the large warehouse owned by Mr. Bertram was being used to store many things to be loaded onto ships. It is understood that at the time of the fire, hundreds of tons of metal and chemicals, including sulphur, are stored in the warehouse. It seems that the intense heat and flames in the cloth factory soon melted the sulphur in Mr. Bertram's warehouse, which poured out in vivid blue flames from the windows and doors. This looked spectacular, falling in brilliant cascades down the wall. By 2 o'clock, Mr. Wilson's factory was completely burnt out. Firemen and soldiers from Gateshead and Newcastle turned their attention to the warehouse instead, but the strength of the fire soon covered the whole 6-story building. We regret to say that the worst was yet to come. We're now standing on the Newcastle side of the quayside, looking across towards St Mary's and, of course, where the warehouse and the factory used to be. You've got to imagine that the fire brigade from Gateshead and the one from Newcastle as well, they're both in there trying to put out the flames as best they can with hand-cranked pumps and with their fire engines, which of course are pulled by horses with tiny little ringing bells. Well, incredibly, a lot of people stood nearby to watch the fire get bigger and bigger and bigger. Some people were standing on the roof of St Mary's. Others were standing in the houses around the houses in Hillgate. Others were on board the ships who were in the middle of the River Tyne. Some sailors even climbed to the top of the riggings to get a better look. Well, to me, the safest place would have actually been to come across the river to where we're standing now in Newcastle, because you've got a nice safe distance. The River Tyne's across there from here, and it means, of course, water can't catch fire. You're going to be perfectly safe. Or so they thought. This is another excerpt from the Gateshead Observer on the 7th of October 1854. By 3 o'clock, a vast crowd had gathered in both Newcastle and Gateshead to watch the fire. Suddenly, a tremendous explosion erupted from the flames. Burning bricks, stones, metal and sulphur were thrown into the air, only to fall on the crowds of people around. Burning materials were thrown across the river, setting fire to ships and to houses, offices and shops in Newcastle. Naturally, those not injured or killed by the falling fire ran to safety. In the confusion that follows, and with Newcastle and Gateshead firemen being stranded in Gateshead, the fire has spread quickly. Well, we're now standing outside the former Church of St. Mary's, which used to be the only church in Gateshead, actually, until the 1820s. And this building has really seen it all in its 900 years. And one of the biggest events that have happened to it would, of course, have been the Great Fire of October the 6th, 1854. Now, the church is literally behind where the explosion took place. So the explosion was so massive they could hear it in Alnwick, they could hear it underground in the mines in Monk Wearmouth Colliery in Sunderland. The miners thought their mine was actually collapsing. The castle keep across the way, although it survived the fire, the oak door was blown off that. All the windows were blown out of all the houses and shops in Newcastle as well. And of course, we've already heard the ships were set fire to, and Newcastle was set fire to as well. Well, St. Mary's was no exception. This historic building, unfortunately, was hit by falling rubble and falling wood from the explosion, and some massive rocks have come through the roof and through the windows of the church and set fire to that as well. There are some fantastic readings, a letter written by somebody who was actually inside the church at the time, and he records how people were actually standing on the roof, stamping out the flames as the hailstones of fire fell around them. Apart from the Gateshead Observer, there's loads of other sources of information about the fire, none of which incidentally tell us how it started. They never found that out at the time. But one of which I've got is actually a souvenir book. But it was made at the time, just after the Great Fire, in the year 1855 it was made. It remembers the people who had died. It's kind of a big obituary about them, really. And it does prove that it really affected young and old, rich and poor alike. So you've got Charles Bertram, the Justice of the Peace, the warehouse hero who tried to put out the flames. It also remembers 3 firemen who died just behind him, trying to put out the flames as well. It remembers Alexander Ralph Dobson, the son of John Dobson, the architect who redesigned St. Mary's after the fire. Over 800 families were made homeless by this. Some people, the youngest person killed was Frank Conway, a little boy aged 6, said he was killed in bed by a stone falling through the roof of his house. There's a spinster here called Sarah Hutchinson, who was aged 65. She died of fright, and there's other people who were killed as they were running to try and get help or save them. Sailors. The Great Fire of Gateshead Newcastle. 1850.